Hello everyone, welcome to today's Daily Devotional. Our devotional today is going to come from Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Starting in verse 1 on through about verse 5 or 6, Solomon deals with the great denominator, the great truth of life that is going to take place that no one can avoid. Starting in verse 1, and we're going to read verses 1 on through verse 6, and then we're going to jump down a little bit and notice something else that he says. Solomon says, "For I considered all this in my heart so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. But for him who is joined to all the living there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love, their hatred, and their envy have now perished. Nevermore will they have a share in anything done under the sun." Ecclesiastes is when I was young and didn't know any better, I thought Ecclesiastes was a very depressing book. Basically nothing matters, so life is just a means to death and so forth. It always kind of struck me as a very somber and depressing book. But after I grew up a little bit and was able to kind of read it with more understanding, I realized that Ecclesiastes is about perspective. It's about reality. And there's this great contrast that he's constantly portraying between the wise and the just versus the wicked and the foolish, as well as those who are alive and those who are dead, all from the perspective of man under the sun. In fact, that's a phrase that comes up all throughout Ecclesiastes, under the sun. That is, here on this earth, from a human perspective, this is the way things are. And so when he writes these things, for instance, the dead know nothing, they have no more. He's not writing that from a spiritual perspective. He's writing that from a physical perspective. Do the dead who have been faithful to the Lord, do they have a reward? Sure. But notice he says, for the memory of them is forgotten. In other words, the memory of them in this world over time goes away. And then he says, their love, their hatred, their envy have now perished. Nevermore will they have a share in anything done under the sun on this earth. And so the great denominator, the great commonality that kind of binds all man together is that everyone will die. In fact, Terry Jones, he had a great invitation last night describing the fact that we're all going to face death one day. And what are we going to leave behind? What kind of example, what kind of reputation will we leave behind? And will we leave a hope behind in the hearts of our loved ones and our friends and family? And when Solomon writes this, when he says, all things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, the unclean. That's death. That's the single event that all people will share, and there's no doubt about it. And then in verse 3, when he says, this is an evil in all that is done under the sun. Now, notice he doesn't say that this is an evil that God has perpetuated on man. Okay, that's not what Solomon says, and he's not saying this from an evil as if it's a sinful thing. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Which is to say, a lot of times, especially from a spiritual perspective, we think of evil as sinful or against God. And that's not what Solomon's perspective is. Again, especially with that phrase, under the sun, it's from the perspective of a human being in the flesh. And basically what Solomon says is it doesn't seem fair. Again, from a human perspective, it doesn't seem fair that one thing happens to all. That the righteous and the wise should have the exact same physical fate that the wicked and the foolish end up having. He says, truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. Okay, they get what they deserve. They die. And yet, even the righteous and the wise suffer the same fate. So, having read this, he describes the fact of make the most of the time that you have, basically. Verses 7 on through verse 10. Make the most of the time you have. Use the time on this earth in a way that recognizes God's blessings, that is full of contentment, that's recognizing God has blessed you and is taking care of you. He's made you sufficient for the day. And then in verse 11, he says, I returned and saw under the sun, notice that phrase again, under the sun, that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. This is one of my favorite verses in all of Ecclesiastes. And it's a wonderful observation by the wise man. He says, I returned and saw under the sun that. And then he describes the common sense narrative. He describes from would be the assumption type of narrative, the common wisdom narrative, versus the reality. He says the race you would think would generally go to the swift, the fastest car, the fastest horse, the fastest person. Not necessarily. In fact, here lately I've been watching some YouTube videos of great sports moments where individuals at the last moment, they are in last place, and then something incredible happens. They all kind of, the people in front of them fall over or whatever, and the person in last place ends up winning. And that's kind of a common theme in some of these videos that show some of these great sports moments and Olympic moments and stuff like that. And Solomon says the race is not always to the swift. Now, he doesn't go into detail to say what could possibly happen that prevents the swift from being first. But the fact is, sometimes things happen. And sometimes the slow one, sometimes the tortoise wins the race, right? Nor the battle to the strong. Generally, you think a battle is won by the strongest, mightiest warriors, the ones with the fanciest weapons and so forth. That's not necessarily true. Nor bread to the wise. Those who are wise, those who have great wisdom to share, generally you would think would be supported by people around them. In fact, the rest of Ecclesiastes chapter 9, he's going to describe how a wise man is able to save a city from being besieged and overthrown, and yet his words and his wisdom is forgotten. And his point here in verse 11 is you would think that the wise would be taken care of, that they'd be revered and that they'd be held in high regard, and therefore they'd be given the food that they need to eat. That's not always the case. Nor riches to men of understanding. You would think people who have great understanding would be able to make good decisions in life, to be able to make good business decisions and so forth, to put them in a position where they would have wealth. Not necessarily. Nor favor to men of skill. People of skill, you would think, would generally be able to do things to put themselves in a position of favor. You think about blacksmiths and silversmiths and people who are highly regarded for skills, especially in Solomon's time. Sometimes favor isn't given to them. All of these types of, and of course, and Solomon could have gone into great more detail, but he says, but time and chance happen to them all. It's interesting when you start studying what the Bible says, especially Solomon, the things that he says about fate and chance. And generally, it's not, the term fate isn't generally used, it's usually chance. Obviously, we as people of faith understand that God is aware of all things. God is in control of all things, and nothing happens with God allowing it to happen. Doesn't mean God causes things to happen, bad things especially. Nothing bad or evil comes from God, but God does allow things to happen. Natural disasters happen according to the laws of nature that God has established in creation. But from a human perspective, again, under the sun, verse 11, that first line, I returned and saw under the sun that. Again, from a human fleshly perspective, here's the things he observed. The race isn't always to the swift, the battle of the strong. Time and chance happen to them all. In the midst of a critical moment, a foe lets his guard down. That may be much stronger, much more powerful, much better armor, but he lets his guard down. And in that moment, someone takes advantage. A runner stubs his toe as he's running around the track. He maybe have been the fastest there by a lot, but he stubbed his toe, and someone who was slower won. Time and chance happened to them all. What's Solomon's point? Especially given kind of the flow of chapter 9 so far. He talks about death being the great denominator, the great common event that all man faces. It's not fair. From a physical perspective, it's not fair. You'd think the righteous and the wise would fare better, but F-A-R-E, fair, but they don't, and that's not fair, F-A-I-R. And then verses 7 on through verse 10, he says, make the most of the time you have. Recognize the blessings of God. And so then starting in verse 11, when he describes all of this, he says, I've observed these things, that life doesn't happen the way you expect it to. Time and chance comes to everyone. But he applies that not just to a race or a battle or bread or riches or favor. Notice what he applies it to. For a man also does not know his time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. He brings this back to the application of how death can come so quickly. That, again, not that God isn't in control. It's not that God's rolling the dice and, chance just happened to come across. That's not what Solomon's point is. Solomon's saying from a human perspective, from our end of the spectrum, okay, we can't see God's big plan. We can't see the full majesty of wisdom in God allowing things to happen. We know it's there, and we trust that God is in control and that all things are going to happen according to His will. We trust that. But still, from our perspective, sometimes things happen randomly. Often, things happen in life that may not be anybody's fault. Again, natural disasters, things like that, that couldn't have been avoided. And that's what Solomon's point is about life. He says, man does not know his time. Man doesn't know when he's going to die. Again, from the richest of us to the poorest of us, to the wisest to the fool, from the wisest to the foolish, from the most wicked to use righteous as a term, but to the most faithful of us. Let's put it that way. The most faithful of us. We're human. That's the way we are. We're human. And we are susceptible to human frailty. And he says, like fish taken in a cruel net. It's like a fish just, swimming, eating, swimming, eating, swimming. And all of a sudden, boom, you're caught in a net. Like birds caught in a snare. Birds just hanging out, doing his thing, flying, landing. Oh, worm, boom, caught in a snare. That's the way life is. It kind of brings to mind the thought process of, I forget what insurance is, it Allstate? I forget which insurance company it is, but there was, for a while, a couple of years ago, there was a insurance thing about life comes at you fast. Okay, and it shows accidents and stuff. You never anticipate an accident. You never go out planning to have an accident. But then it happens, and when it does happen, of course, the stick is that, hey, you need to have insurance, and insurance is going to take care of you, and so forth. But life comes at you fast. Life happens quickly, and you never know what's going to come about. You never know what the next day holds. And for some people, and perhaps this is a great designator of mentality or attitude regarding pragmatists, optimists, and so forth, glass half full versus half empty. For some people, that not knowing what the day holds a great deal of hope and optimism and excitement, because what's going to happen today? Not expecting bad things, expecting good things, wonderful things, opportunities. Then other people, it incites fear because of the unknown. I don't know what's going to happen today. It provides a means of anxiety. It kind of presents a means of fear. And what Solomon describes here is kind of cutting through the narratives that we as human beings tend to project. He says, here's the reality. We are human. We are frail. And it doesn't matter how wicked or faithful you are. Death comes. And the question's going to be, as he mentions earlier in verses 7 on through verse 10, how have you lived your life? Notice Solomon describes, let your garments always be white, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life. He says, all the days of vanity, that is your portion in life, the labor. He says, the days of vanity. It's not that our days are pointless. That's not what his point is. From a physical perspective, it's vanity. Why? Because you have no control over what's going to happen that day. That's why it's vain. You have no power against things happening to you. So all you really have is you and your willingness to obey God or not, your faithfulness. And whether or not you're going to go with the flow, things are going to happen, are you going to stay faithful or not? Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there's no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. Again, from a physical perspective, make the most of the time you have. Use it to be a good example. Use it to be faithful to the Lord. And as Terry was talking last night, I was kind of thinking about a lot of what Solomon's, and certainly Ecclesiastes chapter 9 is but just one snippet in the broader book of wisdom in Ecclesiastes. But I love how Solomon helps us to focus our minds, to have the perspective of reality. Okay, a lot of times it doesn't matter if we're young or older. Sometimes we want to view life through a certain lens, whether you want to call it a rose tinted glasses or whatever. We want to see life from a certain perspective, and that's fine. Sometimes we look at things that way. Solomon is dealing simply in what is, and as long as we remember that this is what is, and that we keep in perspective, keep in appreciation, that each day is a gift from God. Each day is given to us as a means to be a good example, to be a servant, to provide an opportunity to plant the seed of God's word in somebody's heart, in somebody's life. As long as we maintain that perspective, remain faithful to the Lord, let the day come. Don't worry about tomorrow, as Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 6. Tomorrow is going to have its own troubles. Tomorrow will have its own sufficient issues to worry about. You can't deal with today and deal with tomorrow too. Okay, just focus on today. You focus on today being faithful, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then you move on to the next day. And I think that great wisdom, that obviously from God, that great wisdom both from what Jesus says and from what Solomon says, helps us to keep in perspective all of the uncertainty in our society, all of the the churn, I guess you would say. There's so much going on in our society right now, both from a religious perspective, from a concerned citizen perspective, as in America, from politics and so forth. There's so much happening. It's not really new. It's always been happening. But I think the awareness is more because we have more access to news and so forth. And in all of that, sometimes people think, well, God has turned his back on us, or God doesn't care about America or something like that. God is not a nationalist. That may be, some people may find that to be a bad thing to say, but God isn't a nationalist. God cares about all people. He didn't send his son to die just for Americans. He sent his son to die for all people. But that being the case, we have to remember that in all of the difficulty, all of the tribulation, all of the trials that we face, that God has provided us the means to cut through it all, to remember what's most important, and that is our soul and the souls of those around us whom we have an impact, on whom we can have an impact, on whom we can have an influence for good. And we kind of talked about that a little bit on Tuesday as well. But anyway, that was just something I was thinking about. I apologize for going about 20 minutes now. But something I was thinking about. I hope that, especially maybe if you have opportunity to kind of do a broader study of Ecclesiastes, that we all appreciate the wisdom of Solomon, not in making us feel like our life is meaningless and all is vain. Granted, he says at the very beginning, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, says the preacher. Okay, again, from a human perspective, what's the point of it? The point is fear God and keep his commandments. Isn't that what Solomon concludes here in chapter 12 and in verse 13? Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Solomon doesn't say that it's all pointless. What he says is there's really only one thing that really matters. Are you going to fear God and keep his commandments? Because that's really what man's purpose is. And if you're not going to do it, then yeah, it really is vain. There really isn't any point to your life. All right, we'll stop there. I could keep going. All right, so our next daily devotion will be tomorrow at 9. Tomorrow at 6:30, Lord willing. I hope to see you all then. Y'all have a great rest of your evening.